If you've ever had the sudden sinking feeling that something in your relationship shifted and you couldn't prove it, stay with me because what I'm about to explain might make a lot of things suddenly make sense. Before we begin, take 1 second to subscribe and like the video. Not for me, for you. Because the more you understand psychology and relationship dynamics, the less likely you are to ignore the signals that most men miss until it's too late. Now listen carefully. Most men believe cheating is something that explodes into a relationship like a storm. One day everything is normal and the next day everything collapses. But that's not how human behavior works. In psychology, almost every major emotional shift leaves footprints, tiny changes, subtle signals, patterns in behavior that appear long before the truth ever comes out. And I want to slow this down for a moment, because if you're here listening to this, chances are something inside you has already noticed a shift. Maybe you couldn't explain it. Maybe you tried to ignore it. Maybe you even told yourself you were overthinking. But that quiet discomfort you feel, that's not random. That's your mind trying to make sense of patterns that don't quite align anymore. So I want you to be honest with yourself as you listen. Have you felt that subtle distance? Have you caught moments where something just didn't feel the same? If you have, I want you to comment below with the word aware. Not for me, but for you. Because awareness is the first step toward clarity, and clarity is what protects you from confusion that can last months or even years. I'm Mary Smith, host of Senior Mindful Living YouTube channel. Let's go deeper into something most people never fully understand. When men love someone deeply, their brain naturally tries to protect the relationship. This is not weakness. It's actually a psychological defense mechanism. You rationalize, you soften the edges of reality. You tell yourself she's just stressed, just tired, just distracted, just going through something temporary, and sometimes that's true. Life does get overwhelming. People do go through phases, but here's where psychology becomes very precise. Attraction, emotional investment, and secrecy always influence behavior. Always. There is no exception to this rule. Human beings cannot feel differently without acting differently over time. It may not be immediate, it may not be obvious, but the shift always leaks out through patterns. I've worked with countless relationship cases, and there's one pattern that repeats itself with almost uncomfortable consistency. When a woman begins emotionally or romantically investing somewhere else, she rarely announces it. Not because she's calculating or trying to deceive in some dramatic way, but because human beings are incredibly skilled at separating emotions into different compartments. A person can still care about you, still smile with you, still share moments with you, while at the same time, a part of their emotional energy is being redirected somewhere else. And that creates internal tension. That tension becomes guilt. That guilt becomes irritation. And that irritation quietly starts changing behavior in ways that are subtle but very real. Let me give you a real-life example. I once worked with a man who told me nothing was obviously wrong. She still said she loved me. She still spent time with me, but it felt like I was talking to a version of her that was slightly dimmer. That word stuck with me, dimmer, because that's exactly how emotional shifts often feel. Not gone, not broken, just reduced. And that's where most men make their first mistake. They notice something is off, but because they can't point to a clear problem, they doubt themselves. They silence their own intuition. They wait for something more obvious, something undeniable. But by the time it becomes undeniable, the emotional shift has often been happening for a long time. So let's talk about the first sign. And it's not dramatic. It doesn't scream for attention. In fact, it's so subtle that most men dismiss it immediately. Her energy toward you changes. Not overnight. Not in a way that you can easily call out. It's gradual. Almost like someone slowly lowering the brightness on a light you didn't realize was dimming. At first, it shows up in very small ways. She seems a little less excited to see you. The way she used to light up when you walked into the room becomes more neutral. Conversations that once flowed naturally now feel slightly shorter, slightly more surface level. You might tell her about your day, and she listens. But something is missing: the curiosity, the follow-up questions, that spark of genuine interest. And here's the moment where most men go wrong. Instead of observing the change, they react to it by increasing effort. They text more. They try to be more engaging. They plan more things. They give more attention, more energy, more presence. Because in their mind, effort fixes distance. But psychology tells us something very different. Emotional energy doesn't just disappear, it reallocates. Think of emotional attention like a battery. When someone becomes intrigued, excited, or emotionally stimulated by someone new, that battery begins charging in a different direction. And the place it used to charge begins receiving less. That's why this phase feels so confusing. Because on the surface, the relationship still exists. She's still there, she's still talking, she's still present in a physical sense. But emotionally, something feels thinner. There's less warmth in her tone, less spontaneity in her affection, less of that effortless connection that once defined your interactions. And I want you to really think about this. Have you ever sat next to someone you love and still felt alone? That's not just imagination, that's emotional misalignment. Now, here's where it gets even more complex. As emotional distance begins, another layer often appears right behind it: irritation. Suddenly, small things you do start to bother her. Things that never mattered before now seem to trigger subtle frustration. Your jokes don't land the same way. Your habits feel more noticeable. Your presence sometimes feels like it's interrupting something. And this is where confusion turns into self-doubt. You start asking yourself, did I change? Did I do something wrong? Why does it feel like I'm the problem now? But here's the psychological truth that most people never hear. When someone feels emotionally conflicted, their brain often creates distance to reduce guilt. And that distance doesn't always look like silence. Sometimes it looks like impatience. Sometimes it looks like criticism. Sometimes it looks like subtle coldness. Because if the connection feels weaker, the internal conflict feels easier to justify. Now I want to pause here and ask you something important. Have you ever tried to fix a feeling instead of understanding it? Have you ever chased reassurance when what you really needed was clarity? Because those two things are very different. Reassurance temporarily soothes anxiety, but clarity actually resolves it. And when emotional attention begins shifting away from a relationship, there's another signal that often appears next, one that many men notice but don't fully understand. And that's where we're going next. What happens when privacy quietly transforms into secrecy, and why that shift matters more than most people realize, is something we need to unpack very carefully. What happens when privacy quietly transforms into secrecy, and why that shift matters more than most people realize, is something we need to unpack very carefully. Because in every healthy relationship, privacy is normal. In fact, it's necessary. Every individual needs space that belongs only to them. Personal thoughts, private conversations, moments of independence, these are not threats to a relationship. They are part of what keeps a person emotionally balanced. But secrecy is different, and your intuition can feel that difference long before your mind can explain it. Secrecy has a different emotional texture. It feels closed, guarded, slightly tense. It introduces a subtle barrier where openness used to exist, and the shift from privacy to secrecy rarely happens all at once. It begins in ways that are so small, so easy to dismiss, that most men overlook them entirely. Her phone is suddenly face down more often. Notifications that used to light up freely are now cleared quickly. Messages are answered in another room instead of right next to you. If you walk in unexpectedly, there's a slight pause, a quick screen lock, a subtle change in body language. Now, any one of these behaviors on its own means nothing. This is very important. Psychology is never about isolated actions. It's about patterns. But when multiple small changes begin appearing together consistently, that's when your brain starts trying to connect the dots. And this is where many men override their own instincts. You tell yourself, I don't want to be paranoid. You don't want to appear insecure or controlling. So instead of observing the pattern, you minimize it. But here's something I want you to really understand. Your brain is constantly reading microsignals, tone shifts, eye contact, timing, emotional responsiveness, body language. It processes all of this below your conscious awareness. So when something feels off, it's usually because your brain has already detected a pattern your conscious mind hasn't fully articulated yet. That uneasy feeling in your chest, that hesitation before you ask a question, that quiet awareness that something doesn't match the way it used to be, that's data. And instead of dismissing it, you need to learn how to calmly observe it. Let me give you a real-world example. A man I once worked with told me that his partner didn't suddenly become distant. In fact, she was still affectionate in many ways, but he noticed she started taking her phone with her everywhere, even into rooms where she never used to bring it. At first, he ignored it. Then he noticed she began replying to messages more quickly, but never in front of him. Then he noticed that when he casually asked who she was talking to, the answers felt incomplete. Not lies, just lacking detail. That's the key difference. Secrecy often doesn't show up as obvious deception. It shows up as reduced transparency. And psychologically, this makes sense. When someone begins forming a new emotional connection, whether it's innocent at first or not, the brain naturally tries to protect it. Not always consciously, often automatically, it creates a kind of invisible boundary around that interaction. And this is where something called emotional compartmentalization comes into play. This is one of the most important concepts to understand if you want clarity in relationships. Emotional compartmentalization means a person mentally separates different parts of their emotional life so they don't collide. On one side, there's the existing relationship, the shared history, the stability, the familiarity. On the other side, there's something new, the novelty, the excitement, the emotional stimulation, the validation. And instead of confronting the conflict between those two realities, the mind separates them. It creates two emotional spaces that don't interact. But maintaining those separate spaces requires boundaries. And those boundaries often show up as secrecy, not always because something physical has happened. Sometimes it's simply because the emotional connection itself feels significant enough to protect. Now, here's where things become even more confusing for the man experiencing this, because externally, nothing looks extreme. There's no clear betrayal, no obvious event, no undeniable proof, just a growing sense that something is being kept slightly out of reach. And when you try to address it, you may hear responses like, "You're overthinking," or "It's nothing," or "Why are you making this a big deal?" And this creates a psychological trap. Because now you're not just dealing with uncertainty, you're also questioning your own perception. You start wondering, am I imagining this? Am I becoming insecure? But let me ground you in something very important. Healthy openness feels calm. It feels natural. It doesn't make you question your reality. When communication patterns suddenly change, when transparency decreases, when energy feels guarded instead of relaxed, that shift matters. And ignoring it doesn't protect the relationship. It only delays clarity. Now, as this pattern of secrecy continues, something else often begins to emerge. And this is where things take a turn that many men find deeply confusing. Because instead of continued distance, she may suddenly become more vocal, more critical, more focused on what's wrong with you. And this is where we need to talk about one of the most misunderstood psychological mechanisms in relationships: cognitive dissonance. This is the mental discomfort that occurs when someone holds two conflicting realities at the same time. In this context, it looks like this. On one side, there's the belief, I'm in a committed relationship. I care about my partner. On the other side, there's a growing emotional or romantic interest somewhere else. Those two realities don't align, and the brain doesn't like that. So it tries to resolve the tension. But instead of addressing the new emotional connection directly, the mind often takes a different path. It starts reframing the current relationship. And this is where criticism begins to increase. Small imperfections become more noticeable. Habits that once felt neutral now feel irritating. Differences that were once accepted now feel like problems. You might start hearing phrases like, "You've changed," "You don't understand me anymore," "You're not putting in effort like you used to." And for many men, this moment hits hard because now you're not just feeling distance, you're being told that you're the reason for it. So what do? You try to fix it. You analyze your behavior, you become more attentive, you try to improve communication, you put in more effort, hoping that if you just adjust enough, things will go back to how they were. But here's the truth. When criticism is driven by emotional drift rather than actual relationship issues, no amount of self-adjustment fully resolves it. Because the root cause isn't your behavior, it's the internal conflict happening within her. And that's a very difficult reality to accept. Because it means you can't fix something that isn't being caused by you. Let me give you another example. I once spoke with a man who said, "It felt like I was being graded on things that never mattered before. Suddenly, everything I did was slightly wrong." And that's exactly how cognitive dissonance often expresses itself. The brain creates a narrative that justifies the emotional shift. If the relationship feels flawed, then drifting away feels less like a betrayal and more like a reasonable response. And without realizing it, you get pulled into a cycle of trying to prove your worth in a situation where the criteria keep changing. Now, I want you to pause and reflect for a moment. Have you ever found yourself trying harder and harder, only to feel like it was never quite enough? Have you ever felt like no matter what you did, the connection didn't fully return? If that resonates with you, I want you to comment clarity below, because recognizing this pattern is what breaks the cycle. Now, as this internal shift continues, emotional distance, increased secrecy, growing criticism, there is one final signal that quietly begins to surface. And this one is not loud. It doesn't create arguments. It doesn't demand attention. In fact, it often goes unnoticed until it's been happening for a long time. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's where we're going next. The final shift is not something she says, it's something she shows, through where her time, energy, and emotional presence begin to go. Because at the deepest psychological level, what we prioritize reveals what we value. Not what we say we value, not what we intend to value, but what actually receives our time, our attention, and our emotional investment. And this is where the truth becomes very quiet, but very clear. When a woman's emotional focus begins moving elsewhere, her priorities begin to reorganize, subtly at first, then more consistently over time. It might start with scheduling. Plans that were once easy suddenly become complicated. I'm busy becomes more frequent. Time together feels like it has to be negotiated rather than naturally shared. She may cancel more often, reschedule more often, or seem less flexible when it comes to seeing you. But again, the schedule itself is not the most important part. The real signal is emotional presence. Because you can be sitting right next to someone and still feel like they're somewhere else. You might notice her attention drifting during conversations. Her responses become shorter, less engaged. There are more moments of silence that feel different. Not comfortable silence, but disconnected silence. And this is where many men feel something they struggle to put into words. A quiet anxiety. Not panic, not certainty. Just a growing sense that something is slipping. You start questioning yourself again. Am I imagining this? Is this just a phase? Should I say something, or will that push her further away? And in that hesitation, time passes. But here's the truth that most people only recognize when it's too late. When someone's emotional focus moves elsewhere, the relationship they're in often begins to feel like an obligation instead of a priority. An obligation has a very different emotional tone than desire. Desire is spontaneous, it's engaged, it's present. Obligation is scheduled, it's distracted, it's something you fit in. Now I want to ground this in real-life moment, because this is where clarity often hits the hardest. I once worked with a man who told me, we were having dinner together and she was there physically, but I felt like I was eating alone. That sentence carries so much truth. Because emotional absence while being physically present is one of the clearest indicators of disconnection. And when that becomes consistent, it's no longer a moment, it's a pattern. Now here's where we need to shift the conversation slightly, because everything we've talked about so far leads to one very important question. What do you do when you start seeing these patterns? Do you confront immediately? Do you ignore it and hope it passes? Do you try harder to win her back? This is where emotional intelligence matters more than anything else. Because reacting from fear will always lead to the wrong outcome. Chasing, over-questioning, demanding reassurance. These responses often push the dynamic further into imbalance. But silence and avoidance don't help either. So what's the balanced approach? The first step is grounding yourself in observation, not reaction. You don't need to accuse, you don't need to assume the worst, but you do need to stop dismissing what you're consistently experiencing. Patterns matter more than promises. If her words say one thing, but her behavior consistently shows another, behavior is where clarity lives. The second step is honest, calm communication, not emotional confrontation, not blame, but clarity. For example, instead of saying, "You're acting different, what's going on?" which can trigger defensiveness, you might say something like, "I've been noticing a shift in how we connect lately, and I want to understand what's going on because this relationship matters to me." That kind of language opens a door instead of closing it. It invites truth rather than forcing denial. Now, will this always lead to immediate honesty? No. Because if someone is still internally conflicted, they may not fully admit what they're feeling. But here's what it will do. It will bring awareness to the dynamic. And once awareness is present, patterns either correct themselves or they become even clearer. The third step is the hardest, but also the most important. You have to be willing to accept what the pattern is showing you, even if it's not what you want it to be. Because many men stay stuck in a cycle of hoping the past version of the relationship will return. They hold on to memories, they hold on to how things used to feel, and in doing so, they ignore what's happening in the present. But relationships don't exist in memory, they exist in current behavior. And here's a question I want you to sit with. Are you responding to who she is right now, or who she used to be? That distinction alone can change everything. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough. Even if none of these signs lead to cheating, they still indicate emotional disconnection. An emotional disconnection, if left unaddressed, will slowly erode any relationship. So this isn't just about catching something wrong. It's about understanding when something is no longer aligned. And alignment is what creates stability, trust, and long-term connection. Without it, everything starts to feel uncertain. Now I want to give you something practical, something you can actually apply starting today. A simple awareness exercise. For the next few days, instead of focusing on what she says, focus on three things: where her time goes, where her attention goes, and how she makes you feel consistently. Not occasionally, not during isolated good moments, but consistently. Write it down if you need to, because when you step back and look at patterns over time, clarity becomes unavoidable. And clarity is not your enemy, it's your protection. Now, let me say something very important, especially if this topic feels heavy for you. Understanding these patterns is not about becoming suspicious or paranoid, it's about becoming aware. There is a difference between insecurity and awareness. Insecurity reacts without evidence. Awareness observes patterns without denial. And the more emotionally intelligent you become, the less likely you are to stay in situations that slowly drain your confidence, your peace, and your sense of self. Because at the end of the day, a healthy relationship should not leave you constantly questioning where you stand. It should not make you feel like you're competing for attention. It should not require you to prove your worth over and over again. It should feel mutual, balanced, present. Now I want to leave you with one final thought. Sometimes, the hardest truth to accept is not that someone else changed. It's that you finally saw the change clearly. And once you see it, you have a choice: to ignore it and stay confused, or to accept it and move toward clarity. If this message gave you even a small moment of understanding, take a second to like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And more importantly, tell me in the comments, what's one moment where you felt that shift, even if you couldn't explain it at the time? Because your experience matters, and sometimes putting it into words is the first step toward taking your power back.